Right now, as you watch this flame flicker to life, you're witnessing the exact same technology that allowed your ancestors to survive 40,000 years ago. But here's what will blow your mind. While you might use this flame for 30 seconds to light a candle, your prehistoric ancestors used fire for 16 hours straight every single day to stay alive. 16 hours. Think about that for a moment. You sleep for 8 hours, which leaves you 16 waking hours to fill. You probably spend 2 hours eating, maybe 1 hour exercising, 8 hours working, and that leaves 5 hours for everything else. Entertainment, relationships, creativity, problem solving. Now here's the question that's going to haunt you. If your Stone Age ancestors had those same 16 waking hours, but no jobs, no schools, no smartphones, no Netflix, no grocery stores, what the hell did they do with all that time? The answer is going to shock you, because we've been telling ourselves a lie about prehistoric humans for over a century. We picture them as grunting, barely intelligent creatures who spent their days desperately scrounging for food and cowering from predators. Cavemen, we call them dismissively, as if they lived lives of pure survival and nothing else. But what if I told you that your ancestors were actually working fewer hours per week than you do? What if I told you they had more leisure time than most modern Americans? What if I told you they were creating art, composing music, solving complex engineering problems, and having philosophical discussions about the meaning of existence, all while building the foundation for every single thing you consider to be uniquely human? Tonight we're going to follow one prehistoric family through a single day, hour by hour, and discover something that will change how you see yourself, your daily routine, and your place in the grand story of humanity. Because it turns out that everything you do in your modern life, everything you think makes you sophisticated and advanced, was invented by people who never saw a wheel, never planted a crop, and never wrote down a single word. By the time the sun sets on this Stone Age day, you'll realize that you're not watching a documentary about primitive humans. You're watching the origin story of civilization itself, told through the daily routine of the most successful species that ever lived. And you'll discover that the real question isn't what cavemen did all day. The real question is, how did they manage to pack the entire foundation of human achievement into just 16 waking hours? Welcome to the most productive day in human history. A day that happened 40,000 years ago and is still happening right now in everything you do, everything you think, and everything you are. Chapter 1. The Great Awakening. It's pitch black, silent except for the distant call of a night bird, and then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the eastern horizon begins to glow. No alarm clock, no snooze button, no smartphone buzzing with notifications. Just the slow, ancient rhythm of light returning to the world. This is how every human day began for 99% of our species' existence. And in this moment of awakening, we're about to discover something remarkable about our ancestors that will change everything you think you know about primitive life. 40,000 years ago, somewhere in what we now call France, a woman opens her eyes. She doesn't check the time because time, as we understand it, doesn't exist yet. But here's what's extraordinary. She knows exactly what time it is anyway. Her body, her mind, her entire being is synchronized with the natural world in ways that would seem almost supernatural to us today. She's about to begin a day that will challenge every assumption we have about Stone Age life, because this woman, let's call her Aria, is about to demonstrate that our ancestors weren't just surviving. They were mastering skills so sophisticated that most of us couldn't replicate them if our lives depended on it. Aria stretches, and in that simple movement she's already processing information that would overwhelm a modern person. The quality of light filtering through the shelter entrance tells her it's been about 6 hours since sunset. The temperature against her skin suggests the weather will hold steady today. The particular song of the robin outside indicates it's late spring, and the absence of the owl's call means dawn is truly breaking. These aren't conscious thoughts. They're the automatic calculations of a mind perfectly calibrated to its environment. This is what we've lost, and what our ancestors possessed in abundance: the ability to read time from the world itself. Modern archaeological research has revealed something stunning about prehistoric humans and their relationship with time. They didn't just wake up randomly and hope for the best. They had developed what we might call a biological Swiss watch, an internal chronometer so precise that it rivals our modern timekeeping devices. Think about the last time you woke up naturally, without an alarm. Maybe you were camping or on vacation. Remember that slightly disoriented feeling of not knowing exactly what time it was? Our ancestors never experienced that confusion. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe shows that prehistoric humans structured their days around dozens of natural time markers that we've completely forgotten how to read. The position of shadows from familiar landmarks, the angle of sunlight through the shelter opening, the feeding patterns of birds, the blooming cycles of specific flowers, the movement of insects, even the changing scent of the air as dew evaporated. Each of these natural phenomena served as a precise clock face, and our ancestors could read them all simultaneously, creating a temporal awareness that was both broad and incredibly detailed. Here's where it becomes truly remarkable. Recent studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies have shown that people living traditional lifestyles can estimate time with accuracy that often surpasses our digital devices. They can predict sunrise and sunset times weeks in advance, anticipate weather changes days before they occur, and coordinate group activities across vast territories without any form of artificial timekeeping. This isn't primitive timekeeping. This is sophisticated chronometry based on understanding natural systems at a level most modern humans have never even attempted to achieve. But Arya's awakening involves more than just knowing what time it is. As she becomes fully conscious, she's already beginning to process the complex environmental data that will determine not just her day, but potentially her family's survival. The natural clock doesn't just tell time, it reveals the hidden patterns that govern life itself. As Arya sits up, her first conscious act isn't reaching for a coffee cup or checking her phone. Instead, she turns toward the carefully banked fire at the center of her shelter, and in this simple gesture, we witness the beginning of a morning ritual so complex and crucial that getting it wrong could mean death for her entire family. The fire has been burning continuously for months, maybe years. This isn't just a campfire. It's a living technology that requires constant attention, sophisticated fuel management, and deep understanding of combustion principles. Arya examines the coals with the practiced eye of an expert engineer. The colour tells her the temperature. The distribution of embers reveals how the fire has been breathing through the night. The amount of ash indicates fuel consumption rates. She's performing a complex technical analysis that would impress a modern combustion engineer, but to her, it's as natural as breathing. Archaeological evidence from sites like Cavemen Cave in Israel shows that our ancestors maintained fires continuously for hundreds of thousands of years. These weren't occasional campfires, they were sophisticated heating, cooking and manufacturing systems that required the same kind of systematic maintenance we now associate with modern industrial equipment. The daily fire management ritual involved understanding airflow, fuel properties, heat distribution, and even the chemistry of different wood types. Each morning's fire assessment was essentially a technical inspection that would determine the day's capabilities. But the fire ritual goes beyond technical maintenance. As Arya carefully adds specific types of wood in a particular sequence, she's performing what anthropologists now recognize as one of humanity's first manufacturing processes. The choice of fuel wasn't random. Different woods burn at different temperatures, produce different amounts of smoke, and create different qualities of coals. Pine for quick heat, oak for long-burning coals, birch bark for starting flames. Each selection was based on understanding the specific properties of dozens of different plant materials and the intended use for the fire throughout the day. Here's what makes this morning ritual truly remarkable. Arya is planning her day's activities around the fire's capabilities. The temperature and duration of the coals will determine what foods can be cooked and how. The amount of smoke will affect tool manufacturing and hide processing. The quality of light will influence detailed work like tool making or crafting. She's essentially programming a multi-purpose machine that will serve as stove, workshop, light source, and social centre for the next 16 hours. Modern experimental archaeologists who have attempted to replicate Stone Age fire management quickly discover how challenging this daily ritual actually was. Maintaining a fire through varying weather conditions, with limited fuel sources, while producing the specific heat characteristics needed for different tasks, requires a level of technical skill and environmental awareness that takes years to develop. What appeared to be a simple morning routine was actually a sophisticated engineering process that our ancestors had perfected over hundreds of generations. As Arya completes her fire assessment and begins preparing the day's first meal, she's already made dozens of technical decisions that will ripple through her entire day. The fire is ready, but the day's real challenges are just beginning. As the aroma of the morning meal begins to fill the shelter, something magical happens. One by one, other members of Arya's family group begin to stir, and what follows is not the groggy, coffee-dependent awakening we know today, but rather an intricate dance of communication that would put our modern morning news broadcasts to shame. The first exchanges aren't good morning pleasantries, they're rapid-fire information updates that would be familiar to anyone who's worked in a modern emergency response centre. Cale, the group's primary tracker, immediately shares what he heard during his pre-dawn scouting expedition. The elk herd has moved closer to the valley. There are fresh wolf tracks near the water source. The weather patterns suggest a storm system moving in from the west within 2 days. What we're witnessing here is something that archaeologists have only recently begun to understand. Prehistoric humans developed information-sharing protocols that were remarkably sophisticated. These weren't casual conversations, they were systematic intelligence briefings that ensured everyone in the group had access to critical survival information. Recent studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies have revealed that successful groups typically share over 200 distinct pieces of environmental information each morning, covering everything from animal movements to plant ripening cycles to weather predictions. But here's where it becomes truly fascinating. The morning information exchange wasn't just about practical survival data. Anthropologists studying contemporary traditional societies have discovered that these morning conversations serve multiple functions simultaneously. They're news broadcasts, but they're also relationship maintenance, conflict resolution, and social bonding. As Arya listens to Cale's report, she's not just gathering data. She's reinforcing social connections that will be crucial if the group faces challenges later in the day. Consider what this means in practical terms. Aria's group is essentially operating as a highly efficient information processing network. Each member contributes specialized knowledge based on their particular skills and observations. The tracker provides movement intelligence. The gatherer shares plant phenology data. The toolmaker reports on material availability. The weather reader offers atmospheric predictions. Together they create a comprehensive situational awareness that allows the group to make informed decisions about the day's activities. This morning, intelligence gathering had another crucial function that we've only recently discovered through archaeological research. It served as a quality control system for critical survival information. When Kyle reports wolf tracks, others can verify or question his assessment. When the weather reader predicts storms, others can contribute supporting or contradicting observations. This wasn't just information sharing, it was collaborative intelligence analysis that helped ensure the group's decisions were based on accurate data rather than individual mistakes or biases. The social awakening also reveals something profound about prehistoric communication. These morning exchanges required a level of linguistic sophistication that contradicts our image of primitive grunting cavemen. The ability to communicate complex, time-sensitive information about environmental conditions, animal behavior, and resource availability implies that our ancestors had developed nuanced vocabulary and grammatical structures specifically adapted to their survival needs. As the morning conversation continues, Aria processes not just the explicit information being shared, but also the subtle social cues that indicate group dynamics. Who speaks first? Who asks questions? Who offers additional information? Who remains silent? These social patterns will influence the day's group decisions and individual assignments. The morning awakening isn't just about gathering information. It's about negotiating the social structure that will govern the day's activities. But as the conversation reaches its natural conclusion, Aria stands and looks toward the shelter entrance where the morning light is growing stronger. The information has been shared, the social bonds have been reinforced, and now comes the day's first critical decision: where to find food. This choice will determine not just what they eat, but how they spend their energy, where they travel, and what risks they face. The Great Awakening is complete, but the day's real adventure is about to begin. As Aria steps outside into the growing daylight, her mind is already processing the morning's intelligence briefing. The elk herd has shifted position. The storm system is approaching. The plant-gathering areas have changed with the season. She faces a choice that will define her day: pursue the protein-rich but risky hunt, or focus on the plant resources that provide the foundation of her family's diet. What she decides next will reveal something extraordinary about our ancestors, something that challenges our most basic assumptions about prehistoric life. Because Aria is about to demonstrate that the search for food wasn't just about survival. It was about mastering an invisible art so complex, so demanding, that it required skills most modern humans spend decades trying to learn. The hunt for food is about to begin, but it's not the hunt you're thinking of. Chapter 2. Masters of the Invisible Art. You're standing in a modern supermarket, overwhelmed by 37 varieties of breakfast cereal, and you can't decide what to eat. Now imagine your ancestor 40,000 years ago, walking through a forest that looks like nothing but green chaos to your eyes. Yet somehow she knows exactly which of the thousands of plants around her will nourish her family, which ones will heal a sick child, and which ones will kill her if she makes a single mistake. She doesn't have labels, nutritional information, or Google. She has something far more powerful, knowledge so deep and intuitive that it would take a modern botanist decades to acquire. This morning, as the dew still clings to leaves and the first birds announce the day, She's about to demonstrate why gathering wasn't just survival. It was the foundation of human civilization itself. When we think of prehistoric humans, we imagine them desperately hunting mammoths with crude spears. But here's what the archaeological evidence actually tells us. Our ancestors spent roughly 70% of their waking hours not hunting, but gathering plants. And they weren't just randomly picking berries hoping for the best. They were operating with a sophistication that would humble any modern foraging expert. Consider what your ancestor knew by the time she was 20 years old. She could identify over 300 plant species by sight, smell, texture, and even taste. She knew that the bitter acorns from the white oak needed to be processed differently than the sweet ones from the live oak. She understood that elderberries were nutritious when ripe, but potentially toxic when green, and that the timing difference could be as little as 3 days. She recognized that the same plant could be medicine in spring, food in summer, and poison in winter. But here's where it gets truly remarkable. Modern nutritional analysis reveals that prehistoric gatherers achieved dietary diversity that most of us can only dream of. While we might eat 20 different plant foods in a month, they consumed over 150. Their daily caloric intake from plants provided complete amino acid profiles, essential fatty acids, and micronutrients in combinations that surpass most modern diets. They weren't just surviving on plants, they were thriving. This knowledge wasn't written down anywhere. It lived entirely in human memory, passed from parent to child through daily practice. Every morning, walk through the forest was both breakfast and classroom. Every plant encountered was a lesson in chemistry, biology, and nutrition. Your ancestor didn't just see a landscape, she saw a living pharmacy and grocery store combined. Yet something even more fascinating emerges when we examine prehistoric plant processing sites. These weren't simple collection points, but sophisticated food preparation centers. Archaeological evidence shows they developed techniques for removing toxins from otherwise inedible plants, methods for preserving seasonal abundance, and ways of combining different plants to create more nutritious meals than any single plant could provide alone. They were, in essence, the world's first food scientists. But mastering individual plants was only the beginning of their expertise. To truly understand how gathering shaped human civilization, we need to explore how our ancestors learned to read the invisible patterns that governed their entire world. Imagine trying to feed your family for an entire year, but the grocery store only opens at unpredictable times, stocks different items each month, and never tells you what's coming next. This was the challenge facing our prehistoric ancestors, and their solution reveals cognitive abilities that rival modern meteorologists and ecologists combined. Your ancestor didn't just know what plants were available. She knew when they would be available, often predicting seasonal changes weeks or even months in advance. This wasn't luck or intuition. It was applied science based on careful observation of hundreds of interconnected natural phenomena. She knew that when the oak tree's leaves showed their first hint of autumn yellow, it meant the acorn harvest would peak in exactly 12 days. She recognized that certain bird migration patterns indicated a harsh winter was coming, which meant she needed to intensify her gathering efforts immediately. She understood that the angle of morning shadows in late summer could predict exactly when the first frost would kill the tender plants she depended on. But perhaps most remarkably, she could coordinate multiple seasonal timelines simultaneously. Modern research shows that successful prehistoric gathering required tracking at least 15 different natural calendars at once. the berry calendar, which told her when different fruit species would ripen, the nut calendar, which predicted the abundance of tree crops, the root calendar, which indicated when underground storage organs would be at their most nutritious, the leaf calendar, which marked when tender young growth would emerge. Archaeological evidence from seasonal camps reveals that prehistoric communities moved across landscapes with precision timing that suggests advanced planning spanning entire years. They didn't just react to seasonal changes, they anticipated them with accuracy that allowed them to arrive at specific locations exactly when resources reached their peak abundance. This predictive ability required understanding cause and effect relationships that span multiple seasons. For instance, they learned that a particularly wet spring didn't just mean abundant plant growth that year, but also indicated that certain nut trees would produce exceptional crops the following autumn. They could read the landscape like a book whose chapters were written across multiple seasons. The cognitive demands of this seasonal prediction were enormous. They had to maintain mental models of dozens of different ecological systems, track subtle environmental changes across vast territories, and constantly update their predictions based on new information. Modern ecology has only recently developed the computational tools to model the kinds of complex seasonal interactions that our ancestors carried entirely in their heads. Yet even this remarkable seasonal mastery was just part of a larger revolution that would transform not just how humans ate, but how they understood their entire relationship with the natural world. Here's a question that will change how you think about human history. What if the most important moment in our species' development wasn't when we first used fire or created tools or even developed language? What if it was the moment when a prehistoric woman looked at a wild grass seed and thought, what would happen if I planted this in a better spot? The daily practice of gathering created more than just full stomachs. It generated the cognitive frameworks that would eventually become agriculture, mathematics, medicine, and even the scientific method itself. Every morning spent collecting plants was an exercise in pattern recognition, hypothesis testing, and experimental observation that slowly, over thousands of generations, transformed human consciousness. Consider what happened when your ancestor noticed that plants grew better in certain locations. She began to experiment, moving seeds to more favorable spots, clearing competing vegetation, even creating small irrigation channels to direct water where she wanted it. These weren't random acts, but systematic experiments with controls, variables, and measurable outcomes. She was conducting agricultural research thousands of years before agriculture officially began. The mathematical thinking required for successful gathering is staggering when you examine it closely. She had to calculate optimal foraging routes that maximize caloric return while minimizing energy expenditure. She needed to solve complex scheduling problems, deciding which resources to harvest immediately and which to leave for later based on ripening schedules and storage capabilities. She had to manage risk by diversifying her gathering locations, creating what economists would recognize as a sophisticated portfolio of food investments. But perhaps most revolutionary was how gathering changed human social organization. Unlike hunting, which typically involved small groups and brief intense activity, gathering was a community-wide, season-long endeavor that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination. Different individuals specialized in different types of plants. Knowledge was shared systematically across generations. Resource territories were managed collectively to ensure sustainable harvesting. Archaeological evidence suggests that the social structures we associate with early agriculture, permanent settlements, food storage, specialized labor, social hierarchies based on knowledge rather than just physical strength, all first appeared in gathering societies thousands of years before anyone planted the first crop. The gathering revolution didn't just feed our ancestors, it taught them how to live together in ways that made civilization possible. Modern studies of the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies reveal something even more profound. Groups that rely heavily on gathering develop egalitarian social structures, sophisticated sharing networks, and decision-making processes that ensure resources are distributed fairly across the community. They create what anthropologists call gift economies, where social status comes not from accumulating resources, but from giving them away strategically. The daily practice of gathering, it turns out, didn't just provide calories. It provided the social, cognitive, and technological foundation for everything we recognize as distinctly human civilization. Every time your ancestor bent down to collect a handful of seeds, she was participating in the slow transformation of our species from simple tool users into the complex, cooperative, forward-thinking beings we are today. Yet as remarkable as this gathering revolution was, it was about to be joined by an activity that would test every skill our ancestors had developed and push human cooperation to its absolute limits. As the morning sun climbed higher and the best gathering opportunities of the early day drew to a close, our ancestors faced a critical decision. The plants they had collected would sustain them, but plants alone weren't enough. The human brain, enlarged by generations of cooked food, demanded more calories than gathering could consistently provide. They needed protein, high-quality, energy-dense nutrition that could only come from one source. But obtaining it would require them to organize into hunting parties capable of strategies so complex, coordination so precise, and courage so absolute that failure wouldn't just mean hunger, it could mean death. As they prepared their weapons and formed their teams, they were about to engage in an activity that would reveal humans to be not just intelligent gatherers, but the most formidable apex predators the world had ever seen. Chapter 3. The Apex Predator's Gamble. You're standing in a modern sporting goods store, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of hunting equipment. High-powered rifles with laser scopes, GPS tracking devices, camouflage gear designed by military engineers, and boots that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Now imagine trying to take down a 1-ton mammoth with nothing but a wooden stick and a sharp rock. Impossible? That's exactly what our ancestors did on a Tuesday afternoon. And they didn't just succeed, they turned it into an art form so sophisticated that modern military strategists still study their techniques. Welcome to the world of prehistoric hunting, where humans transformed themselves from vulnerable primates into the planet's most formidable predators, using nothing but their minds, their teamwork, and an arsenal of innovations that would make a modern engineer weep with admiration. When archaeologists first discovered 40,000-year-old spear points in caves across Europe, they made a mistake that would persist for decades. They assumed these tools were crude, primitive attempts at weaponry, the Stone Age equivalent of a child's first attempt at whittling. They couldn't have been more wrong. Under the lens of modern microscopic analysis, these ancient spear points reveal something extraordinary. The stone edges show microscopic serrations that increase cutting efficiency by 30% compared to a smooth blade. The hafting techniques, how the stone point attached to the wooden shaft, demonstrate an understanding of stress distribution that wouldn't be formally documented by engineers until the 19th century. Most remarkably, Different points were specifically designed for different prey, with varying weights, angles and penetration characteristics that show our ancestors understood ballistics in ways that would make a modern weapons designer nod with respect. Consider the Schöningen spears discovered in Germany, wooden hunting spears that are 400,000 years old. These aren't simple sharpened sticks. Each spear is balanced with the precision of a modern javelin, with the centre of gravity positioned exactly where it needs to be for maximum throwing distance and accuracy. The wood itself was carefully selected from specific parts of trees, harvested at particular times of year to ensure optimal hardness and flexibility. This wasn't random experimentation. This was systematic engineering that required generations of accumulated knowledge and testing. But here's what's truly mind-bending about prehistoric tool technology. They didn't just make one type of spear or arrow. Archaeological sites reveal entire toolkits with specialized implements for every conceivable hunting scenario. Heavy thrusting spears for close combat with large prey, light throwing spears for mid-range attacks, tiny precise arrow points designed to deliver poison deep into an animal's bloodstream, multi-pronged fish spears that account for light refraction in water. Each tool represents not just individual craftsmanship, but a sophisticated understanding of physics, materials, science and animal anatomy. The manufacturing process itself reveals the depth of their technological revolution. Creating a single high-quality spear point required between 50 and 100 precise strikes with a hammerstone, each one calculated to remove exactly the right amount of material to achieve the desired shape and sharpness. Master toolmakers could predict how stress fractures would propagate through stone, with mathematical precision, essentially solving complex three-dimensional engineering problems in their heads while working with materials that would shatter if they made a single mistake. This wasn't primitive technology. It was appropriate technology, perfectly adapted to its environment and purpose. And it was just the beginning of what our ancestors would accomplish when they turned their technological genius toward the challenge of cooperative hunting. If you've ever tried to coordinate a group dinner where everyone arrives on time, you understand the challenge of human cooperation. Now imagine coordinating a hunting party where split-second timing means the difference between a successful hunt and becoming someone else's dinner. Our ancestors didn't just master this challenge, they turned cooperative hunting into a form of warfare so sophisticated that modern military academies still study their tactics. The archaeological evidence tells us a remarkable story. At sites like Boxgrove in England and Torralba in Spain, we find the remains of hunts that required levels of coordination that would challenge a modern special forces unit. Picture this scenario. 30 hunters working together to drive a herd of massive aurochs, wild cattle that stood 6 feet tall and weighed as much as small cars, into a carefully prepared kill zone. This wasn't a spontaneous chase. This was a carefully orchestrated military operation that required reconnaissance, strategic planning, precise timing and flawless execution. The reconnaissance phase alone demonstrates remarkable sophistication. Hunters had to track herds for days or even weeks, learning their movement patterns, identifying the strongest and most dangerous animals, and locating the optimal ambush sites. They studied wind patterns to ensure their scent wouldn't alert the prey. They identified escape routes and positioned secondary teams to cut off fleeing animals. This wasn't hunting, this was intelligence gathering that would impress a modern military strategist. The planning phase reveals even more complexity. Archaeological evidence shows that successful large-game hunts required advanced preparation of the hunting ground itself. Hunters would construct drive lanes, carefully placed obstacles that would funnel animals toward killing zones. They would dig pitfall traps that required understanding of soil mechanics and animal behavior. Most remarkably, they would create what archaeologists call procurement systems, integrated landscapes of traps, blinds, and drive lanes that could be used repeatedly over generations. But the execution phase is where the true genius of cooperative hunting becomes apparent. Radio communications didn't exist 40,000 years ago, yet hunting parties achieved coordination that would be impossible without constant communication. How? They developed a sophisticated system of hand signals, bird calls, and visual cues that allowed hunters spread across miles of terrain to act as a single coordinated unit. They perfected techniques for surrounding prey that required each hunter to anticipate not only the animal's behavior, but the actions of every other hunter in the group. The roles within a hunting party were as specialized as those in a modern military unit. There were scouts who identified targets and assessed risks. There were drivers who moved animals towards the kill zone. There were interceptors who cut off escape routes. There were primary hunters who made the kill. There were support hunters who provided backup. And there were what we might call battlefield medics, hunters whose job was to track wounded animals and ensure no prey escaped to suffer unnecessarily. Perhaps most impressively, these hunting parties developed what military strategists call adaptive tactics, the ability to modify their approach in real time based on changing conditions. If the wind shifted and alerted the prey, they had contingency plans. If a key hunter was injured, others could seamlessly fill their role. If the animals behaved unexpectedly, the entire operation could be reconfigured on the fly without breaking down into chaos. This level of cooperation required something even more remarkable than tactical skill. It required trust. Each hunter had to have absolute confidence that every other hunter would play their role perfectly, because a single mistake could get someone killed. This trust wasn't built overnight. It was the product of years of training, practice, and shared experience that created bonds stronger than those in many modern military units. But all the technology and coordination in the world wouldn't have mattered without the most sophisticated weapon our ancestors possessed, their understanding of the animal mind itself. If you've ever watched a nature documentary and wondered how the cameraman knew exactly where the lion would appear, you're beginning to understand the challenge our ancestors faced every day. They didn't have the luxury of multiple attempts or long-range telephoto lenses. They had one chance to predict exactly what a wild animal would do next, and their lives depended on getting it right. This is where prehistoric hunters revealed themselves to be something far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. They were applied animal psychologists whose understanding of wildlife behavior was so precise it bordered on supernatural. But it wasn't magic. It was the culmination of thousands of years of careful observation, experimentation, and knowledge accumulation that turned our ancestors into masters of the animal mind. Consider what it meant to hunt a mammoth, an animal with intelligence comparable to a modern elephant, capable of complex emotions, social bonds, and strategic thinking. These weren't mindless giants stumbling through the landscape. They were sophisticated creatures with excellent memories who could recognize human threats from miles away, communicate danger to their herd through infrasonic calls we couldn't even hear, and coordinate defensive strategies that could easily turn hunters into the hunted. Our ancestors had to become mammoth psychologists. They studied how these animals reacted to different types of threats. They learned that mammoths would form defensive circles when protecting their young, but would scatter when surprised by loud noises. They discovered that older females were the decision-makers in the herd, and that targeting the matriarch would send the entire group into predictable panic patterns. They understood that mammoths had excellent memories and would avoid areas where they'd previously encountered human hunters, requiring hunting parties to constantly adapt their strategies and locations. But mammoth hunting was just one example of the psychological mastery our ancestors achieved. Different prey required completely different psychological approaches. Hunting red deer meant understanding their elaborate social hierarchies and the ways dominant males would respond to territorial challenges. Hunting wild horses required knowledge of their lightning-fast flight responses and their tendency to circle back to familiar grazing areas. Hunting bison meant exploiting their herd mentality and their vulnerability to panic-driven stampedes. The depth of this psychological knowledge becomes clear when we examine specific hunting strategies that archaeologists have reconstructed from bone assemblages and tool distributions. One technique, found at multiple sites across Europe, involved what we might call psychological harassment. Hunters would deliberately show themselves to prey animals, not to attack, but to create a state of constant low-level stress that would exhaust the animals and make them easier to approach for the actual kill. This required understanding not just animal behavior, but animal psychology. The difference between fear that causes immediate flight and anxiety that causes gradual fatigue. Even more remarkably, our ancestors learned to exploit the emotional bonds between animals. They understood that mother mammals would risk their own lives to protect their offspring, and they developed strategies that used this maternal instinct to their advantage. They knew that social animals would often refuse to abandon injured herd members, creating opportunities for hunters who understood how loyalty could become vulnerability. The psychological game extended beyond individual animals to entire ecosystems. Successful hunters had to understand the complex relationships between predator and prey species. They learned that hunting wolves would change the behavior of deer herds. They discovered that the presence of certain bird species indicated the location of carcasses or the movement of large game. They developed what we might call ecological psychology, an understanding of how the mental states of different species influenced each other across the entire food web. Perhaps most impressively, our ancestors learned to think like multiple different species simultaneously. During a single hunt, they might need to predict the behavior of their primary prey, anticipate the reactions of potential competitors like wolves or hyenas, account for the alarm calls of various bird species, and coordinate with their fellow humans, all while adapting to changing weather conditions and terrain challenges. This wasn't just hunting, it was conducting a complex psychological orchestra where every movement had to be perfectly timed and executed. This psychological mastery wasn't learned overnight. It was the product of lifelong study that began in childhood and continued until death. Children learned to read animal tracks not just as physical signs but as psychological stories. This deer was nervous because of the wolf scent. This mammoth was favouring its left front foot because of an old injury. This bison herd was agitated because they'd been separated from their usual grazing grounds. Every track, every scat, every disturbed piece of vegetation told a story about the animal's mental state, and our ancestors learned to read these stories with the precision of modern psychiatrists. But even with all this technological sophistication, tactical coordination, and psychological mastery, our ancestors faced one more challenge that would test every skill they had developed: the fundamental question of risk and reward that made hunting the ultimate gamble with death itself. Imagine walking into a casino where the stakes aren't money, but your life and the survival of your family. Every decision you make could result in either the greatest triumph of your existence or your immediate death. There are no second chances, no safety nets, and no emergency services waiting to rescue you if things go wrong. This was the reality our ancestors faced every time they decided to hunt, and it transformed them into the most sophisticated risk calculators in human history. The mathematics of prehistoric hunting were brutal and unforgiving. Success meant protein, fat, and nutrients that could sustain a family for weeks. Failure meant starvation, exposure, or death by trampling, goring, or mauling. But between these two extremes lay a complex spectrum of partial successes, Pyrrhic victories, and calculated losses that required our ancestors to develop decision-making skills that would challenge a modern emergency room doctor. Consider the risk assessment that went into targeting different prey species. A rabbit hunt was relatively safe, but provided minimal calories relative to the energy expended. A mammoth hunt could feed an entire community for months, but carried the very real possibility of multiple fatalities among the hunting party. Our ancestors had to calculate not just the probability of success, but the cost of failure, the energy expenditure required, the seasonal availability of alternatives, and the social consequences of different outcomes. They were essentially running complex cost-benefit analyses in their heads while facing down animals that could kill them in seconds. The evidence for this sophisticated risk calculation comes from careful analysis of bone assemblages at prehistoric sites. When archaeologists examine the species composition of ancient meals, they find patterns that reveal remarkable strategic thinking. During harsh winters, when failure meant starvation, hunting parties focused on high-probability, medium-reward targets. During abundant seasons, they were more willing to take risks on high-reward prey. When community size was small, they avoided dangerous hunts that could eliminate key hunters. When populations were stable, they were more willing to accept casualties in exchange for major protein gains. But the most remarkable aspect of prehistoric risk management was how our ancestors learned to stack the odds in their favor through careful preparation and strategic thinking. They didn't just wander into the wilderness hoping to encounter prey. They spent days or even weeks preparing for major hunts, gathering intelligence about animal movements, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. They developed what we might call probability maps, detailed knowledge of where different prey species were most likely to be found at different times of day and year. The social dimension of hunting risk adds another layer of complexity that our ancestors had to master. A successful hunt wasn't just about individual survival, it was about community survival, social status, and the complex web of obligations and relationships that held prehistoric society together. Young hunters had to prove themselves through increasingly dangerous challenges. Experienced hunters had to balance their own safety against their responsibility to train the next generation. Leaders had to make decisions that could save or doom entire communities. Archaeological evidence reveals that our ancestors developed sophisticated protocols for managing hunting casualties. They created backup plans for when key hunters were injured or killed. They developed medical techniques for treating hunting injuries that wouldn't be formally documented until the development of modern trauma surgery. They established social safety nets to ensure that the families of hunters killed in action would be cared for by the community. This wasn't just risk management. It was the beginning of social insurance systems that would eventually evolve into modern civilization. The psychological pressure of constant life-or-death decision-making created what we might recognize as the first forms of systematic mental training. Hunters developed rituals and practices designed to manage fear, maintain focus under extreme stress, and make clear decisions when adrenaline was flooding their systems. They learned meditation techniques that helped them remain calm when facing charging megafauna. They developed breathing exercises that improved their accuracy with projectile weapons. They created mental rehearsal practices that allowed them to run through complex hunting scenarios in their minds before facing them in reality. Perhaps most remarkably, our ancestors learned to embrace uncertainty as a fundamental aspect of existence. They understood that perfect prediction was impossible, that even the best planning could be undermined by random events, and that survival often depended on the ability to adapt quickly to rapidly changing circumstances. This acceptance of uncertainty wasn't fatalism. It was a sophisticated understanding of probability and chaos theory that allowed them to make optimal decisions, even when they couldn't control all the variables. The ultimate evidence of their risk management sophistication comes from the simple fact that they survived. For hundreds of thousands of years, human hunters consistently succeeded in one of the most dangerous occupations imaginable. They didn't just survive, they thrived, expanding into new territories, developing increasingly sophisticated technologies, and building the foundations of human civilization. Every successful hunt was a victory against overwhelming odds, a testament to planning, skill and courage that allowed our species to climb to the top of the food chain, armed with nothing but our intelligence and our willingness to take calculated risks in pursuit of our survival. But as the sun began to sink toward the horizon and the day's hunting drew to a close, our ancestors would return to their communities carrying more than just meat and hides. They carried stories, experiences and innovations that would transform not just their survival strategies, but their understanding of what it meant to be human. And it was in the quiet hours of late afternoon, as the adrenaline faded and reflection began, that they would begin to channel their remarkable minds toward pursuits that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with the mysterious human need to create beauty in a dangerous world. The hunting was over, the dangers had passed, and the immediate needs of survival had been met. But for our ancestors the day was far from finished. As they cleaned their weapons and prepared their kills, something extraordinary would begin to happen. Something that would reveal our prehistoric forebears to be not just master hunters and survivors, but the world's first artists, musicians and visionaries. Because once a human has conquered the challenge of staying alive, the next question becomes, what does it mean to truly live? Chapter 4. The Creative Revolution. You're holding a paintbrush in your hand, standing before a blank canvas about to create something that has never existed before. That moment of creative possibility, that spark of imagination transforming into reality, is one of the most distinctly human experiences we know. But here's what might surprise you. That exact same feeling, that identical creative impulse, was experienced by a human being 40,000 years ago as they prepared pigments deep inside a cave in what we now call France. The difference? Their canvas was a living rock wall, their studio was lit by flickering firelight, and their art supplies had to be gathered from the earth itself, processed by hand and applied with tools they carved from bone and wood. Yet when archaeologists discovered these ancient masterpieces, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. The technical skill, artistic vision, and creative sophistication were so advanced that many of these prehistoric paintings could hang in the Louvre today and draw crowds of admirers. This wasn't primitive scribbling or accidental decoration. This was the birth of human creativity itself, the moment our species discovered that survival wasn't enough, that we needed beauty, meaning and expression to truly live. And it happened not occasionally, not as rare moments of inspiration, but as part of daily life, woven into the very fabric of how our ancestors spent their afternoons and evenings. Let me take you back to a late afternoon 35,000 years ago, in the limestone caves of what we now call the Dordogne region of France. The hunting parties have returned, the day's gathering is complete, and as shadows lengthen outside, a small group of humans ventures deep into the cave system carrying torches, pigments and tools. They're not seeking shelter. They're heading to their art studio. What we've discovered about these first artists would challenge everything you think you know about prehistoric intelligence. Take the caves at Lascaux, where archaeologists found not just beautiful paintings, but evidence of sophisticated artistic planning that would impress any modern art teacher. The artists didn't randomly splash paint on walls. They studied the natural contours of the rock surface and used them as part of their composition, making a bulge in the stone become the belly of a bison, or a depression become the eye socket of a horse. But here's where it gets truly remarkable. These artists created their own scaffolding systems to reach high walls, developed colour-mixing techniques that produced gradients and shading, and even used a form of perspective that wouldn't be invented again until the Renaissance. Chemical analysis of their pigments reveals they weren't using whatever colours happened to be nearby. They were travelling dozens of miles to collect specific minerals, ochre from one region, manganese from another, because they wanted particular shades for their artistic vision. Think about what this means for a moment. These people were dedicating significant time, energy and resources not to immediate survival needs, but to creating something beautiful. They were making conscious aesthetic choices, developing artistic techniques and passing down creative knowledge from one generation to the next. This wasn't folk art or casual decoration. This was serious artistic practice that required dedication, skill, and what we can only call professional-level expertise. Recent discoveries have made this even more astounding. In the Cueva de las Manos in Argentina, archaeologists found handprint stencils that show evidence of artistic experimentation spanning thousands of years. Different generations of artists returned to the same walls, adding their own hands but also building on the work of their predecessors, creating layered compositions that show artistic evolution over time. They were creating art galleries that would remain active longer than recorded human history. But perhaps most fascinating of all is what we've learned about their creative process. Analysis of paint drips and brushstrokes suggests these artists worked in teams, with some people preparing pigments while others sketched outlines and still others filled in colours. They had developed collaborative artistic methods that mirror how major art projects are undertaken today. They understood that creating something truly magnificent required not just individual talent, but organised creative effort. The technical sophistication goes even deeper. At Chauvet Cave, scientists discovered that the artists used a technique called stumping, blending colours with their fingers or tools to create soft, realistic shading. They understood how to use the flickering torchlight to create the illusion of movement, painting animals in positions that would seem to run and leap when viewed by firelight. These discoveries force us to completely reimagine what prehistoric daily life looked like. While we might picture our ancestors spending every moment focused on basic survival, the reality is that they were allocating significant portions of their day to purely creative pursuits. They were artists, and being an artist was apparently just as important to human life 35,000 years ago as it is today. But creating visual art was only one dimension of their creative revolution. As afternoon turned to evening, our ancestors would turn to another form of expression that was perhaps even more central to their daily lives, one that would literally give voice to the human experience. If you've ever found yourself humming a tune while working, or felt your heart rate sync with a drum beat, or experienced that inexplicable emotion that only certain melodies can evoke, then you've connected with something that may be among the oldest human experiences. Our prehistoric ancestors weren't just making visual art in those afternoon hours, they were creating the world's first music, and what we're discovering about their musical sophistication is revolutionizing our understanding of early human culture. The oldest musical instrument ever found is a flute carved from a bird's wing bone, discovered in a German cave and dated to over 40,000 years ago. But this isn't some crude whistle. It's a precisely crafted instrument with carefully placed finger holes that could produce a range of musical notes. The level of mathematical understanding required to create this instrument is staggering. The maker had to understand acoustics, pitch relationships, and the physics of sound production. They had to know exactly where to place each hole to create the desired musical intervals. Think about that for a moment. While we often imagine prehistoric humans as barely articulate, they were actually creating instruments that required sophisticated understanding of mathematical relationships and acoustic principles. They weren't just making noise, they were making music, which means they understood melody, rhythm, and harmony in ways that suggest musical traditions that were already ancient by the time this flute was carved. Archaeological evidence suggests that music wasn't a rare activity reserved for special occasions, but was woven into the fabric of daily life. Stone Age sites across Europe contain percussion instruments made from mammoth bones, wind instruments crafted from cave bear femurs, and even what appear to be resonating stones that were selected and placed specifically for their acoustic properties. These people were creating orchestras. But here's what's truly fascinating. Recent studies of these ancient instruments reveal that our ancestors were working within musical scales and harmonic structures that are remarkably similar to those used in traditional music around the world today. This suggests that there might be something fundamentally human about certain musical relationships, that the mathematics of harmony might be hardwired into how our brains process sound and emotion. The daily importance of music becomes clear when we consider how it would have functioned in prehistoric society. Music was likely essential for coordination during group activities like hunting or gathering. Rhythmic chanting could help synchronize movement during long journeys. Musical signals could communicate across distances in ways that speech couldn't. And in the evening hours, music would have been crucial for social bonding, storytelling, and cultural transmission. Imagine the scene. As daylight fades, the community gathers around the fire. Someone brings out bone flutes, others produce rhythm stones, and the daily transformation from work to social time is marked by music. Children learn traditional melodies that carry information about seasonal changes, animal behavior, and cultural values. Adults compose new songs that tell the story of the day's hunt or celebrate a successful gathering expedition. This wasn't just entertainment, though it certainly was entertaining. Music was serving multiple crucial functions simultaneously. It was education, with complex information encoded in memorable melodies. It was social bonding, creating shared emotional experiences that strengthened group cohesion. It was cultural preservation, ensuring that important knowledge would be passed down accurately through generations. And it was psychological therapy, providing emotional release and communal processing of daily stresses and challenges. Recent neurological research helps us understand why music was so central to prehistoric life. Music activates multiple brain regions simultaneously, areas responsible for pattern recognition, emotional processing, motor coordination, and memory formation. For our ancestors, engaging in daily musical activity would have been like a comprehensive brain workout that enhanced cognitive function, strengthened social bonds, and improved group coordination all at once. The evidence suggests that by 40,000 years ago, human communities had developed complex musical traditions that were passed down through generations, modified and improved over time, and integrated into virtually every aspect of daily life. They had discovered that music wasn't just pleasant sounds, it was a technology for enhancing human cooperation, learning and emotional well-being. But music, like visual art, was just one way our ancestors were using their afternoon and evening hours to create something beyond mere survival. As the fire burned brighter and the community gathered closer, they would turn to perhaps the most uniquely human creative act of all, the one that would ultimately give birth to literature, philosophy, and the very concept of meaning itself. Close your eyes and imagine the most compelling story you've ever heard, one that made you forget where you were, that transported you completely into another world, that changed how you understood something important about life. Now imagine that story being told not from a book or screen, but by a master storyteller sitting across a flickering fire, using nothing but voice, gesture, and the power of words to create entire universes in your mind. This is where human storytelling began, in those precious evening hours when prehistoric communities gathered around fires and transformed the day's experiences into something much larger. Narratives that would preserve knowledge, transmit values, and create the very foundation of human culture. What we're discovering about prehistoric storytelling is that it wasn't primitive entertainment, but the sophisticated information technology that made complex human civilization possible. The archaeological evidence for prehistoric storytelling is necessarily indirect. Stories don't fossilize, but it's everywhere once you know how to look for it. Cave paintings often appear in sequences that suggest narrative progression, showing not just individual animals but hunting scenes, seasonal changes, and what appear to be mythological stories. Stone carvings found across Europe show recurring symbols and patterns that suggest shared cultural narratives spanning thousands of miles and generations. But the most compelling evidence comes from understanding what stories would have meant to prehistoric survival. These weren't just evening entertainment, they were the primary method for preserving and transmitting critical life or death information. A story about tracking a particular animal through seasonal migrations wasn't just interesting. It was a survival manual encoded in memorable narrative form. A tale about identifying poisonous plants wasn't folklore, it was medical training disguised as entertainment. Consider what this means about the cognitive sophistication required. Creating effective stories that could accurately preserve complex information while remaining engaging enough to be remembered and retold required advanced understanding of human psychology, memory formation, and narrative structure. Prehistoric storytellers had to be part teacher, part entertainer, part librarian, and part scientist, masters of information encoding who could transform abstract knowledge into compelling human drama. The social dynamics of storytelling reveal even more sophistication. Archaeological evidence suggests that different community members specialized in different types of stories. Some focused on practical knowledge, hunting techniques, plant identification, weather prediction. Others specialized in cultural narratives, stories about community values, social relationships, and moral principles. Still others appear to have been the keepers of what we might call mythological stories, grand narratives about human origins, the nature of the world, and humanity's place in the cosmos. This specialization suggests that prehistoric communities had developed something like professional storytelling traditions, with master storytellers who trained apprentices and maintained narrative accuracy across generations. Recent studies of isolated indigenous communities have revealed storytelling traditions that have preserved accurate historical information for thousands of years, passed down entirely through oral narrative. If these traditions can maintain accuracy for millennia today, there's no reason prehistoric storytellers couldn't have achieved the same feat. But prehistoric storytelling wasn't just about preserving existing knowledge, it was also about creating new understanding. Stories provided a framework for processing experiences, for finding patterns and meaning in the complexity of daily life. When a hunting expedition went wrong, or when unusual weather patterns appeared, or when social conflicts arose, stories provided a way to analyze what happened, extract lessons, and develop better strategies for the future. The evening storytelling circle was essentially a prehistoric think tank, where the community's collective intelligence was brought to bear on survival challenges through narrative analysis. Each day's experiences were transformed into stories, compared with traditional narratives, and either integrated into existing cultural knowledge or used to modify and improve traditional understanding. The psychological importance of storytelling becomes clear when we consider its role in creating meaning and identity. Humans appear to be unique among animals in our need to understand not just what happens, but why it happens and what it means. Stories provided the framework for answering these fundamentally human questions. They transformed random events into meaningful patterns, individual experiences into shared understanding, and daily survival into purposeful existence. Recent neuroscience research reveals that storytelling activates the same brain regions in both storyteller and audience, creating a form of mental synchronization that enhanced group cohesion and mutual understanding. When prehistoric communities gathered for evening storytelling, they weren't just sharing information, they were literally synchronizing their minds, creating shared mental models of reality that enabled unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination. The evidence suggests that by 40,000 years ago, human communities had developed storytelling traditions so sophisticated that they functioned as comprehensive cultural operating systems, preserving technical knowledge, transmitting values, processing experiences, and creating shared meaning that bound individuals into cohesive, purposeful communities. But stories, music, and visual art weren't separate creative activities. They were all part of a larger creative revolution that was transforming how humans approached every challenge they faced. As the evening deepened and the creative energy of the community reached its peak, our ancestors would turn to perhaps the most practical expression of their creativity, the constant innovation that was revolutionizing their daily lives. Every time you use a tool that's been modified to work better, every time you find a more efficient way to accomplish a routine task, every time you solve a problem by combining existing resources in a new way, you're participating in the same creative process that occupied hours of our ancestors' daily lives. What we're discovering about prehistoric innovation is that our ancestors weren't just using tools, they were constantly improving them, experimenting with new approaches, and developing solutions to daily problems with a creativity and sophistication that would impress any modern engineer. The archaeological record reveals that tool innovation was happening so rapidly during the prehistoric period that archaeologists can trace technological evolution almost year by year in some sites. Stone tools that began as simple cutting implements were constantly being refined, made sharper, more durable, better adapted to specific tasks. But what's remarkable isn't just that tools were improving, but how they were improving. The changes show evidence of systematic experimentation, hypothesis testing, and iterative design improvement that mirrors modern engineering methodology. Take something as seemingly simple as the spear point. Early versions were basically sharpened sticks. But by 30,000 years ago, prehistoric innovators had developed composite spear points that combined stone tips, wooden shafts, and organic adhesives in precisely engineered configurations. These weren't accidental improvements. They show evidence of understanding principles of materials, science, stress distribution, and aerodynamic efficiency that wouldn't be formally codified until thousands of years later. The innovation process reveals sophisticated problem-solving approaches. Archaeological sites show evidence of what can only be called research and development areas where prehistoric inventors tested new designs, discarded failed experiments, and refined successful innovations. Tool fragments show attempts to solve specific problems, making cutting edges sharper, handles more comfortable, or joints more secure. These people were thinking like engineers, identifying problems, developing solutions, and iterating toward optimal designs. But the innovation wasn't just about tools. It extended to every aspect of daily life. Shelter construction shows constant experimentation with new materials, improved structural designs, and better methods for insulation and weatherproofing. Food preparation techniques evolved to extract more nutrition from available resources, preserve food for longer periods, and make previously inedible materials digestible. Clothing construction advanced from simple animal skins to complex multi-layer garments designed for specific climatic conditions. What's particularly fascinating is evidence of collaborative innovation. Many archaeological sites show tool-making areas where multiple people work together, sharing techniques, comparing results, and collectively solving design challenges. Innovation wasn't happening in isolation. It was a community activity where the collective intelligence of the group was focused on improving daily life through creative problem-solving. The speed of innovation reveals the cognitive sophistication involved. In some archaeological sequences, you can see new tool designs appearing, being modified and improved, then spreading to other communities within just a few generations. This suggests that prehistoric innovators weren't just accidentally stumbling onto improvements. They were systematically exploring design possibilities, rapidly evaluating results, and efficiently sharing successful innovations with others. Recent experimental archaeology has revealed just how sophisticated this innovation process was. Modern experts attempting to recreate prehistoric tools often require extensive training to achieve the precision and efficiency that appear to have been routine for our ancestors. The level of technical knowledge required for some prehistoric innovations suggests that communities had developed something like apprenticeship systems where innovation skills were formally transmitted from master crafters to students. The evidence suggests that innovation wasn't a rare burst of genius, but a constant daily activity. People were continuously modifying their tools, improving their techniques, and experimenting with new approaches to routine tasks. This wasn't just practical necessity. It appears to have been intellectually satisfying in the same way that creative problem-solving is rewarding for humans today. The psychological dimension of prehistoric innovation becomes clear when we consider its social implications. Successful innovators gained status within their communities, creating incentives for creative thinking and experimentation. Innovation became a form of social expression, where individuals could demonstrate intelligence, creativity, and practical skill. This transformed innovation from mere necessity into a valued cultural activity that attracted the community's most capable minds. Perhaps most remarkably, prehistoric innovation shows evidence of long-term thinking and planning that challenges assumptions about primitive short-term survival focus. Some innovations clearly required extended experimentation and wouldn't have provided immediate benefits. They were investments in future improvements that suggest our ancestors were thinking strategically about technological development over time, horizons measured in generations, not just seasons. The cumulative effect of constant daily innovation was revolutionary. Each small improvement built on previous advances, creating an accelerating pace of technological development that was transforming human capabilities at an unprecedented rate. Our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were actively engineering better ways to live, systematically improving their quality of life through creative application of intelligence to practical problems. By the end of each day, prehistoric communities had typically generated new ideas, tested innovative solutions, and implemented improvements that made their lives more efficient, more comfortable, or more secure. They were living in a constant state of creative problem-solving that was simultaneously practical and intellectually stimulating. But as the evening deepened and the day's innovations were shared around the fire, our ancestors would prepare for one final creative act, one that would integrate all the day's creative activities into something larger, something that would define what it means to be human. As the fire burned lower and the creative energy of the day reached its crescendo, our prehistoric ancestors had accomplished something extraordinary. In those afternoon and evening hours, they'd created art that rivals modern masterpieces, composed music that reveals sophisticated understanding of harmony and rhythm, told stories that preserved crucial knowledge while creating meaning and identity, and developed innovations that would transform human capabilities for generations to come. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this creative revolution wasn't any individual achievement, it was that it happened every day. Art, music, storytelling and innovation weren't rare special occasions, but routine parts of daily life that our ancestors considered as essential as finding food or building shelter. They had discovered something that we're only beginning to understand today, that creativity isn't a luxury that becomes possible after survival needs are met, but a fundamental human requirement that makes survival meaningful. They needed beauty, expression, innovation and meaning, not despite their challenging circumstances, but because of them. Creativity was their response to the complexity of existence. their way of transforming mere survival into truly human life. As the last stories were told and the final innovations were shared, our ancestors would prepare for the most crucial part of their day. The hours when all their creative achievements would be tested against the ultimate challenge that every human community has faced since the beginning of time. For as darkness settled over the prehistoric world, they would need every bit of ingenuity, cooperation, and psychological resilience they had developed during their creative hours to face the dangers that emerged when the sun went down. Chapter 5. The Fire Circle. It's 35,000 years ago, and the sun has just disappeared behind the hills of what we now call France. A small group of humans, perhaps 8 or 10 individuals, begins to gather around a carefully constructed circle of stones. But this isn't just any gathering. What's about to unfold in the next few hours will be more transformative to human evolution than the invention of the wheel, more significant than the discovery of agriculture, and more fundamental to who we are today than any technological breakthrough you can imagine. Because tonight, like every night for thousands of generations, these humans are about to participate in the single most important daily ritual in human history, one that literally created the modern human mind. Welcome to the Fire Circle, where humanity was born. The first flame that crackles to life tonight represents far more than warmth or light. Think about what's really happening here. For the first time in Earth's history, a species has gained the ability to extend the day beyond sunset. Every other creature on the planet remains bound by the ancient rhythm of light and darkness, but humans have broken free. They've stolen time itself from the natural world. But let's be clear about what this means. When we talk about fire technology, we're not talking about striking a match. Creating and maintaining fire in the Stone Age required a mastery of chemistry, physics, and engineering that would challenge most modern humans. Our ancestors had to understand which woods burned at different temperatures, how to create the perfect balance of oxygen and fuel, and most crucially, how to keep that fire alive through wind, rain, and the long watches of the night. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe tells us that prehistoric fire hearths weren't random arrangements of burning wood. They were sophisticated installations, carefully designed with reflecting stones to maximize heat distribution, draft channels to control airflow, and even primitive chimneys to direct smoke away from living areas. These weren't campfires. They were humanity's first engineered technology. But here's what makes this truly revolutionary. Fire created the first truly communal space in human history. Before fire, our ancestors were scattered during the dangerous hours of darkness, huddled individually in whatever shelter they could find. Fire changed everything. Suddenly 8 to 10 people could gather in a shared space of warmth and light, close enough to see each other's faces, to share food, to communicate in ways that had never been possible before. And it was this technological breakthrough that began to reshape the human brain itself. The extra calories from cooked food provided the energy needed to support larger brains, while the extended social time around the fire created the evolutionary pressure for more sophisticated communication and thinking. Every night, as our ancestors fed wood to their fires, they were literally feeding the growth of human consciousness. But fire didn't just extend the day, it transformed what those extra hours could become. Which brings us to perhaps the most remarkable discovery about these evening gatherings. Listen carefully to the sounds around this prehistoric fire. What you're hearing isn't just casual conversation. You're witnessing the birth of human language itself. Recent research in evolutionary linguistics suggests that the complex language abilities that separate humans from all other species may have evolved specifically during these evening fire gatherings. Think about the conditions that surround the fire circle. For the first time in evolutionary history, humans have both the time and the social proximity necessary for extended communication. During the day, survival demands immediate action, pointing, simple warning calls, basic coordination signals. But around the fire, with food prepared and immediate dangers held at bay by the light, our ancestors had something unprecedented, leisure time for conversation. This is where the magic begins. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human brains were already capable of complex thought, but they lacked the social pressure to develop equally complex communication. The fire circle changed that overnight, literally. Suddenly, there was time to share detailed information about the day's discoveries, to debate the best hunting strategies, to describe distant territories and seasonal patterns that others hadn't experienced firsthand. But more than that, the fire circle created the world's first storytelling venue. Imagine an elder describing a successful hunt from years past, not just for entertainment, but as crucial survival information for younger members of the group. To make these stories memorable and compelling, they would need to employ narrative techniques, character development, dramatic tension, vivid imagery. They would need to invent metaphor, symbolism, and abstract thinking. Linguistics researchers have discovered something fascinating. The most complex grammatical structures in human languages tend to be those used for storytelling and sharing experiences that happened in other times and places. These are exactly the kinds of communication needs that would have emerged around prehistoric fire circles. Every night, as our ancestors struggled to convey increasingly complex ideas to each other, they were literally inventing the grammatical structures that would become the foundation of all human language. And here's the truly remarkable part. Recent studies of isolated hunter-gatherer communities suggest that their most sophisticated language use still occurs during evening fire gatherings. After tens of thousands of years, we're still using our most advanced communication abilities in the same context where they first evolved. But language was just the beginning of what these fire circles created, because once humans could communicate complex ideas to each other, they began to do something that would transform them from just another intelligent species into something entirely new. What you're looking at around this fire isn't just a social gathering. It's humanity's first university, research laboratory, and cultural institution all rolled into one. Every evening, our ancestors were conducting the most important experiment in human history, the systematic accumulation and transmission of knowledge. Consider what's actually happening here. An experienced toolmaker is showing a younger person how to create a more effective spear point, not through trial and error, but through deliberate instruction. An elder who has lived through many seasons is sharing detailed observations about weather patterns and animal behavior. A skilled gatherer is describing the location and preparation methods for plants that others have never encountered. This is cultural evolution in action, and it's happening at a pace that biological evolution could never match. Instead of waiting thousands of years for genetic changes to spread through a population, useful innovations could be shared and adopted within a single generation. The fire circle became a mechanism for accelerating human development at unprecedented speed. But the true genius of these evening gatherings goes deeper than simple information sharing. Archaeological evidence suggests that prehistoric humans were conducting something remarkably similar to what we now call peer review. When someone proposed a new hunting technique or described an unfamiliar territory, the group would question, debate, and test these ideas collectively. Bad information was filtered out, good ideas were refined and improved, and the best innovations were preserved and passed on. We can see evidence of this process in the archaeological record. Tool technologies that took thousands of years to develop suddenly appear at multiple sites across vast distances, suggesting rapid cultural transmission. Artistic styles spread across continents. Even abstract concepts like numerical systems and calendar keeping seem to have been shared between distant groups through these evening knowledge exchanges. But perhaps most remarkably, these fire circles became the birthplace of human innovation itself. With time to think, discuss, and experiment, our ancestors began to imagine possibilities that didn't yet exist. They started asking what-if questions that would lead to entirely new technologies and ways of living. The fire circle became humanity's first think tank, where creative problem-solving became a daily practice. And this brings us to something that archaeologists are only now beginning to understand about these gatherings. Something that reveals just how sophisticated our ancestors' inner lives really were. As the fire settles into glowing embers and the sounds of the night world grow louder beyond the circle of light, something profound is happening to the humans gathered here. They're experiencing what may be the first distinctly spiritual moments in human history. And it's happening for reasons that are both deeply practical and mysteriously transcendent. Think about the psychological reality of this situation. Our ancestors are surrounded by darkness that they know contains very real dangers. They're kept safe by nothing more than a controlled chemical reaction that they must constantly tend. Above them, the night sky displays a vast universe that operates according to patterns they can observe but not fully understand. In this context, it's almost inevitable that they would begin to contemplate questions that go beyond immediate survival. Recent research in cognitive archaeology suggests that the daily transition from the busy, practical activities of daylight to the reflective, contemplative atmosphere of the fire circle may have been where humans first developed the capacity for abstract thinking about existence itself. The fire circle created the world's first dedicated space for pondering the big questions. Why do we exist? What happens when we die? What forces control the patterns we see in nature? But this wasn't just philosophical speculation. These evening contemplations had immediate practical value. Developing theories about natural patterns helped our ancestors predict seasonal changes, weather patterns, and animal behavior. Creating mental models of unseen forces helped them understand cause and effect relationships that improved their survival strategies. Archaeological evidence supports this connection between spiritual development and practical knowledge. The earliest human burial sites, with their careful arrangement of bodies and inclusion of grave goods, suggest that our ancestors had developed complex ideas about death and afterlife. The first cave paintings often seem to represent not just the physical world, but symbolic or spiritual concepts. Even the careful maintenance of fire itself became ritualized, with evidence suggesting that different types of fires were used for different purposes: cooking, tool-making, and what appear to be ceremonial functions. What's emerging from these discoveries is a picture of prehistoric humans who were simultaneously practical and spiritual, logical and mystical. The fire circle provided a daily opportunity to integrate these different ways of understanding the world, creating the foundation for all future human philosophy, religion and science. And this integration of practical and spiritual thinking would prove crucial as our ancestors faced their greatest daily challenge, one that tested not just their physical preparations, but their psychological resilience in ways that would shape human nature forever. As the flames begin to die down and the prehistoric night deepens around our ancestors, they're about to face the ultimate test of everything they've learned about survival, cooperation, and courage. Because in a world where darkness brings genuine terror, where unseen predators hunt just beyond the reach of firelight, our ancestors had to develop something more than just physical defenses. They had to master the most dangerous enemy of all, their own fear. The fire circle has prepared them well. They've shared knowledge, strengthened social bonds, and reinforced their spiritual resilience. But now, as they prepare for sleep, they must trust that all of this preparation will be enough to see them safely through to morning. Because the night shift is about to begin, and it will reveal our ancestors at their most vulnerable and their most ingenious. Chapter 6. Guardians of the Night. It's 3 a.m., and you wake up to a strange sound outside your house. Your heart races as you lie there in the darkness, listening. Now you reach for your phone's flashlight, check your security system, maybe peer through the blinds at the street lamp illuminating your yard. Within moments, you've assessed the threat and returned to sleep, protected by walls, locks, lighting, and the knowledge that help is just a phone call away. Now imagine that same 3 a.m. moment 40,000 years ago. No walls except what you've built with your own hands. No lights except the dying embers of your fire. No phone, no police, no neighbours within shouting distance. Just you, your family, and the vast predator-filled darkness pressing in from all sides. The sound you heard? It could be nothing. Or it could be the last thing you ever hear. This is the reality our ancestors faced every single night of their lives. And not only did they survive it, they mastered it. Tonight, we discover how prehistoric humans transformed from prey, cowering in the darkness, into the guardians of the night themselves. When the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, our ancestors didn't simply crawl into their shelters and hope for the best. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe reveals something remarkable. These communities developed sophisticated security systems that would impress modern military strategists. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, researchers have uncovered evidence of deliberate settlement patterns that tell an extraordinary story. The arrangement of hearths, the positioning of shelters, the strategic placement of tool caches, all of it points to careful planning for nighttime defense. These weren't random camps thrown together at the end of a long day. These were fortified positions designed by people who understood that survival meant thinking like generals. But perhaps most fascinating is what we've learned about their watch rotations. Microscopic analysis of tool wear patterns suggests that different individuals were responsible for maintaining fires and monitoring perimeters at different times throughout the night. Think about what this means. In a group of perhaps 20 or 30 people, including children and elders, they developed a system where the strongest and most alert took turns staying awake while others slept. This wasn't just about physical endurance. The night watch required remarkable psychological discipline. Imagine being the person responsible for your family's safety during the darkest hours before dawn, when human alertness naturally wanes and the mind plays tricks. You're fighting not just external threats, but your own biology, which is screaming at you to sleep. Yet archaeological evidence suggests these watch systems functioned effectively for thousands of years. Recent studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups who still maintain traditional practices give us clues about how this might have worked. The Hadza people of Tanzania, for instance, have developed intricate systems of subtle communication during night watches, specific coughs, movements and fire-tending patterns that convey information without alerting potential threats. Our prehistoric ancestors likely developed similar codes, turning the simple act of stoking a fire into a complex language of safety and vigilance. But this raises a profound question. How do you train someone to be an effective night guardian when a single mistake could mean death for everyone you love? The answer lies in something our ancestors built that was perhaps even more sophisticated than their watch systems, their shelters themselves. When we think of prehistoric shelters, we often picture crude huts cobbled together from whatever materials happen to be nearby. The reality revealed by modern archaeology is staggeringly different. Our ancestors were master engineers who understood principles of structural integrity, insulation, camouflage, and defensive positioning that wouldn't look out of place in a modern architectural textbook. Consider the mammoth bone houses discovered at Mezhyrich in Ukraine. These aren't just impressive because they used mammoth bones. They're impressive because they represent solutions to complex engineering problems. How do you create a structure that's stable enough to withstand winter storms, insulated enough to maintain warmth with minimal fuel, and defensible enough to protect against both predators and human threats? The answer required understanding weight distribution, thermal dynamics, and structural engineering. The builders of these shelters had to calculate load-bearing capacity, using materials that varied wildly in size and strength. They had to understand how different arrangements of bones would affect wind resistance and snow load. They had to solve ventilation problems, allowing smoke to escape while preventing heat loss and maintaining structural integrity. Each of these challenges required not just trial and error, but systematic thinking and the ability to visualize complex three-dimensional relationships. But the engineering extended far beyond just putting materials together. Excavations reveal evidence of sophisticated site preparation, drainage systems to prevent flooding, foundation work to ensure stability, and careful positioning relative to prevailing winds and natural landscape features. These people were thinking like civil engineers, considering not just immediate needs, but long-term sustainability and maintenance. Perhaps most remarkably, many of these shelters included features that served specific nighttime defensive purposes. Interior layouts that allowed rapid movement between different sections, multiple exit routes that wouldn't be obvious to external observers, sight lines that enabled defenders to monitor approaches without exposing themselves, storage areas positioned to allow quick access to weapons and tools in complete darkness. The construction of these shelters required something else that's easy to overlook: massive coordination and planning. Moving and positioning mammoth bones weighing hundreds of pounds each required teams working in precise coordination. This wasn't casual construction. It was organized engineering that demanded project management skills, resource allocation, and quality control. Yet even the most sophisticated shelter was only as strong as the people defending it. Which brings us to perhaps the most complex challenge our ancestors faced, not just surviving the physical dangers of night, but conquering the psychological demons that darkness brings. Fear in the darkness isn't just an emotion, it's a survival mechanism that kept our ancestors alive. But paradoxically, uncontrolled fear could be just as deadly as the threats it warned against. A person paralyzed by terror couldn't respond effectively to danger. A community torn apart by panic couldn't coordinate defense. So our ancestors had to develop something remarkable: systematic methods for managing fear itself. Archaeological evidence suggests they created elaborate rituals specifically designed to provide psychological comfort during the dangerous night hours. Carved figurines, deliberate arrangements of personal objects, and evidence of specific fire-tending ceremonies all point to practices that served not just practical purposes, but psychological ones. These weren't superstitions, they were sophisticated techniques for emotional regulation. Consider what we've learned from the arrangement of personal objects found in prehistoric sites. Items weren't just scattered randomly around living spaces. Instead, we see deliberate patterns, tools arranged within easy reach, but in specific orders, personal ornaments positioned where they could be touched for comfort, food stores organized not just for efficiency, but for psychological reassurance. These arrangements suggest people who understood that feeling prepared and in control was just as important as actually being prepared. But the most sophisticated psychological tool our ancestors developed was something we might not immediately recognize as such: storytelling during the night hours. Traces of ochre and charcoal found in specific patterns around hearths suggest that nighttime wasn't just about maintaining vigilance. It was about maintaining morale through narrative. Think about the psychological brilliance of this approach. When you're sitting in a small circle of firelight, surrounded by vast, threatening darkness, your imagination naturally fills that darkness with dangers that may be far worse than reality. But when an experienced storyteller begins weaving tales of ancestors who faced similar dangers and survived, of heroes who conquered greater threats, of communities that prospered despite overwhelming odds, something powerful happens. The darkness becomes not just a void filled with unknown threats, but a stage where human courage and intelligence have repeatedly triumphed. Recent neuroscience research helps us understand why this approach was so effective. Storytelling activates the same neural pathways used for actual experience, allowing listeners to essentially practice courage and problem-solving in a safe mental environment. Our ancestors were unknowingly developing what modern psychologists now call cognitive behavioral therapy, using controlled mental rehearsal to manage fear and anxiety. But they took this even further. Evidence suggests they developed specific stories and rituals for different types of night threats. Different seasonal dangers required different psychological preparations. The approach to managing fear during winter storms was different from the approach used during periods of predator activity. This wasn't just generic comfort, it was targeted psychological intervention. Yet all of these psychological techniques were built around a fundamental understanding that would have made them effective: the recognition that the human mind during sleep enters a realm that's just as important for survival as waking consciousness. While our ancestors stood guard against external threats, their sleeping minds were engaged in work that may have been just as crucial for survival. Recent research in neuroscience and evolutionary psychology suggests that prehistoric humans may have developed sophisticated approaches to dreams and sleep that served essential functions we're only beginning to understand. Consider the challenge. You're living in an environment where the difference between life and death often comes down to split-second decisions based on pattern recognition. Did that sound indicate a predator, or just wind through the trees? Is that movement in the distance a threat or just shadows? Your brain needs to be constantly updating its threat detection algorithms based on new experiences, and it turns out that much of this crucial processing happens during sleep. Archaeological evidence provides tantalizing hints that our ancestors understood this intuitively. Sleeping arrangements in prehistoric sites weren't random. They show clear patterns that suggest people positioned themselves not just for warmth and protection, but in ways that might have enhanced the dreaming process. Individuals often slept in positions where they could observe the fire even while unconscious, potentially allowing the brain to continue processing visual information during sleep states. But the most intriguing evidence comes from what researchers call dream artifacts, carved objects and cave paintings that seem to depict impossible or fantastical scenes that may represent dream imagery. These aren't just artistic expressions, they may be evidence of sophisticated dream work, where communities actively use the dreaming state for problem-solving and knowledge transmission. Think about the survival advantages this could provide. During dreams, the brain can safely rehearse responses to dangerous situations, combining memories in new ways to generate novel solutions to survival challenges. A hunter who dreams about tracking patterns might wake up with insights about animal behavior that could mean the difference between success and failure on the next hunt. A gatherer who dreams about plant combinations might discover new food preparation techniques that could sustain the community through lean periods. Modern neuroscience tells us that during REM sleep, the brain consolidates memories, processes emotional experiences, and creates new neural connections that enhance learning and problem-solving. Our ancestors may have intuitively recognized these benefits and developed practices to enhance them. Evidence of specific sleeping positions, the use of particular herbs near sleeping areas, and even the timing of when different community members slept all suggest systematic approaches to optimizing the dreaming process. Perhaps most remarkably, some prehistoric sites show evidence of what appear to be collective dreaming practices, arrangements that would have allowed multiple people to influence each other's dream states through shared sensory experiences during sleep. Imagine the evolutionary advantage of a community that could collectively process survival challenges through coordinated dreaming, sharing insights and solutions at the unconscious level. But even the most sophisticated dream work couldn't eliminate every danger. As dawn approached and the night watch prepared to wake the sleeping community, they carried with them not just relief at surviving another night, but accumulated wisdom that would shape the future of human civilization. As the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, our ancestors who had stood guard through the night hours faced a moment of profound transition. They had successfully defended their families against the darkness once again. But in doing so, they had also been quietly accumulating something that would prove even more valuable than their immediate survival: the systematic knowledge, organizational skills, and technological innovations that would eventually transform their world completely. The techniques they developed for nighttime survival, the engineering principles behind their shelters, the organizational systems that coordinated their defenses, the psychological methods that conquered fear, and the dream work that enhanced their problem-solving abilities, all of these innovations contained the seeds of everything we consider modern civilization. Tomorrow, we'll discover how these nightly lessons in survival became the foundation for agriculture, technology, and the complex societies that define human civilization today. Chapter 7. The Seeds of Tomorrow. Imagine holding a smartphone in your hand and realizing that every component, from the glass screen to the microprocessor, can trace its origins back to a prehistoric human squatting by a riverbank, carefully chipping away at a piece of flint. That connection isn't metaphorical, it's real. Every innovation that defines our modern world began as a small daily decision made by our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago. Tonight, as we've followed our prehistoric family through their day, we've witnessed something extraordinary. We've watched civilization being born, one ordinary moment at a time. The question isn't whether cavemen created our world. The question is how something as simple as gathering berries for breakfast could eventually lead to space travel, and how the evening conversations around a Stone Age fire could become the Internet. The answer lies in understanding that evolution doesn't just shape our bodies, it shapes our ideas, and those ideas compound across generations in ways that would astonish even our most brilliant ancestors. You've probably heard the story of agriculture as humanity's great leap forward, the moment we stopped wandering and started farming, transforming from nomads into settlers almost overnight. But that story is wrong. The real story is far more remarkable, and it begins with something we witnessed earlier today. A prehistoric woman walking through a meadow, her eyes scanning the ground with the focused intensity of a botanist. Watch her closely. She's not just picking random plants. Her grandmother taught her that the seeds from this particular grass, when they're just beginning to turn golden, but before they fall, can be ground into a paste that stores for months. Her mother showed her how to recognize which tubers are safe to eat by the shape of their leaves and the time of year they emerge. She knows that if she harvests the outer bulbs from this patch of wild onions, but leaves the centre ones, next year there will be twice as many. This knowledge didn't appear suddenly. It accumulated over thousands of years, passed down through countless daily gathering expeditions. Every morning when our ancestors set out to find food, they were conducting botanical experiments. Which plants grew back faster when harvested in certain ways? Which ones produced more seeds when the surrounding vegetation was cleared? Which combinations of plants seemed to thrive when they grew near each other? Think about the intellectual achievement this represents. Our ancestors developed detailed mental maps of dozens of square miles of territory, tracking hundreds of different plant species through their entire life cycles. They understood soil conditions, seasonal weather patterns, and the complex relationships between different plants and animals. They could predict, months in advance, when and where different foods would be available. This wasn't simple survival. This was applied ecology at a level that would challenge modern graduate students. But here's what makes this truly revolutionary. Our ancestors began to notice that their daily gathering activities were changing the landscape itself. Areas where they regularly collected seeds began producing more of those plants. Paths they walked repeatedly became clearings where certain useful plants flourished. Without intending to, their daily food-gathering routine was already beginning to shape the environment. The leap to deliberate farming wasn't a sudden inspiration. It was the inevitable result of thousands of years of daily observation and unintentional cultivation. Our ancestors didn't invent agriculture, they discovered that they had been accidentally practicing it all along. But this realization would lead them to ask a question that would change everything. If we can influence what grows here by accident, what could we accomplish if we did it on purpose? Every piece of technology in your life, from the chair you're sitting in to the device you might be watching this on, is the descendant of a tool that was first crafted by firelight in a prehistoric camp. But the path from that first carefully chipped stone to your smartphone reveals something profound about human nature. We are a species that cannot stop improving things. Consider the simple act we observed this morning, our prehistoric toolmaker examining her hand axe before the day's work began. She runs her thumb along the edge, feeling for tiny chips that might cause the tool to slip or break. She notices that yesterday's work has dulled the blade slightly, so she selects a small piece of harder stone and makes a few precise strikes to resharpen it. This seems routine, unremarkable. But pay attention to what's actually happening here. She's not just maintaining a tool, she's engaging in iterative design improvement. Each time she resharpens that axe, she's making tiny adjustments based on how it performed the day before. Maybe she angles the edge slightly differently because she noticed it cut more efficiently that way. Perhaps she adjusts the balance because her wrist ached after extended use. These microscopic improvements, multiplied across thousands of days and thousands of individuals, are how a simple stone became the foundation of all human technology. This is how innovation actually works, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through countless small refinements. Our ancestors didn't wake up one morning and decide to invent the wheel. Instead, they spent generations moving heavy objects on logs, gradually noticing that round logs worked better than angular ones, that some sizes rolled more easily than others, that objects stayed on the logs better when the logs were guided in tracks. The wheel wasn't invented, it was discovered through thousands of daily applications of practical problem solving. But here's what's truly remarkable. Our ancestors developed a technology transfer system that ensured these improvements didn't die with their creators. Watch how our toolmaker works. She's not alone. A younger woman sits nearby, ostensibly working on her own project, but her eyes constantly flick over to observe the expert's technique. She's not just learning to make tools, she's absorbing generations of accumulated improvements and innovations. This is humanity's secret weapon. We don't just pass on our genes, we pass on our ideas. And unlike genetic evolution, which takes generations to show results, technological evolution can accelerate. Each generation starts not from scratch, but from the highest achievement of the previous generation. A young person today who learns to code isn't beginning with the first computer. They're building on millions of hours of programming work that came before them. This compounding effect means that technological progress isn't linear, it's exponential. The daily tool improvements of our Stone Age ancestors led to bronze tools, which led to iron tools, which led to steel tools, which led to precision machinery, which led to computer chips. Each step enabled the next step to happen faster and reach higher. The smartphone in your pocket contains more computing power than was used to land humans on the moon, but it exists because a prehistoric human decided to make her stone axe just a little bit sharper. The moment that may have mattered most in all of human history happened around a Stone Age campfire, and it probably seemed completely ordinary at the time. Two people had a disagreement, maybe about how to share the day's hunt, or whose turn it was to tend the fire, or where the group should travel next. Instead of fighting or splitting apart, they talked it through until they reached an agreement that both could accept. In that simple act of negotiation and compromise, they invented civilization. Every law, every government, every international treaty, every marriage vow, every business contract traces its lineage back to that first moment when humans discovered they could resolve conflicts through words instead of violence. But the path from a Stone Age argument to the United Nations Charter reveals something crucial about how complex social structures actually develop. They don't start with grand philosophical principles, they start with the practical need to get along well enough to survive another day. Think about what we observed throughout our prehistoric day. These weren't isolated individuals struggling alone against nature. They were members of a sophisticated social organization that coordinated hunting expeditions, shared resources, cared for children and elderly members, and made collective decisions about when and where to move. This level of cooperation required something that no other species had fully developed: the ability to create and follow abstract social rules. Consider the complexity of what happened during the morning hunt. Multiple individuals had to coordinate their actions perfectly, often without being able to communicate directly. They had to trust that each person would perform their assigned role, even when that role involved personal risk for the group's benefit. They had to have systems for deciding who leads, who follows, and how to handle disagreements about strategy. Most remarkably, they had to have mechanisms for sharing the results fairly, even though different people contributed different types and amounts of effort. This wasn't instinct. This was learned social behavior, passed down through generations and constantly refined through trial and error. Groups that developed better cooperation systems were more successful at hunting, gathering, and surviving. Groups that couldn't resolve conflicts peacefully split apart or destroyed themselves. Natural selection wasn't just shaping human bodies, it was shaping human societies. But here's what makes human social evolution unique. We developed the ability to create rules that exist independently of the people who created them. When our prehistoric leader made a decision about how to divide the day's catch, she wasn't just making a one-time choice. She was establishing a precedent that would influence similar decisions in the future. Over time, these precedents became customs, and customs became laws, and laws became the foundation of civilization. The evening discussions around the fire weren't just social bonding, they were democracy in its earliest form. Important decisions were debated, different viewpoints were considered, and consensus was reached through discussion rather than force. The person speaking held authority not because they were the strongest or most feared, but because the group had collectively agreed to listen to them. In those fire-lit conversations, humans invented the concept of legitimate authority based on mutual consent. This is why every human society, no matter how isolated, develops systems of rules, leadership, and conflict resolution. We're not blank slates that need to be taught how to cooperate. We're the descendants of ancestors who survived precisely because they learned to cooperate better than anyone else. The social contract isn't an artificial constraint imposed on naturally selfish individuals. It's the fundamental technology that made us human in the first place. Here's a thought that might change how you see your own life. You are living inside the same story that began when the first human looked up at the stars and wondered what they were. Every choice you make, every problem you solve, every relationship you build is part of an unbroken chain of human experience, stretching back to our earliest ancestors. You're not just living your own life, you're continuing their story. This isn't metaphorical or poetic, it's literally true. The language you're using to understand these words evolved from the first meaningful sounds our ancestors made around their fires. The tools you use, from the simplest spoon to the most complex computer, are direct descendants of the first stone tools. The social structures that govern your life, your family relationships, your work, your community, all trace their origins back to the first human groups that learned to cooperate for survival. But the connection goes deeper than shared origins. The same fundamental challenges our prehistoric ancestors faced every day are the same challenges you face in your modern life, just expressed in different forms. They had to figure out how to find and prepare food. You have to figure out what to eat and how to afford it. They had to maintain tools and shelter. You have to maintain your car and your home. They had to navigate complex social relationships within their group. You have to navigate relationships with family, friends and co-workers. Most importantly, they had to balance individual needs with group survival, just as you have to balance personal desires with social responsibilities. The prehistoric human who shared their food with a sick group member was grappling with the same fundamental ethical questions you face when you decide whether to help someone in need. The parent who spent evening hours teaching their child essential survival skills was confronting the same challenges of education and child-rearing that parents face today. This continuity reveals something profound about human nature. We haven't actually changed as much as we think we have. Beneath the technology and the complex institutions, we're still driven by the same basic motivations that drove our Stone Age ancestors. We want to survive and thrive, to care for our loved ones, to create things that matter, to understand our world and to be remembered after we're gone. Understanding this connection changes everything. When you're struggling with a difficult decision, you can draw strength from knowing that humans have been successfully navigating similar challenges for tens of thousands of years. When you feel overwhelmed by the complexity of modern life, you can remember that your ancestors faced equally complex challenges with far fewer resources, and not only survived but built the foundation for everything you enjoy today. But perhaps most importantly, recognizing this unbroken chain helps you understand your own responsibility as a link in that chain. Just as your ancestors' daily choices shaped the world you inherited, your daily choices are shaping the world your descendants will inherit. Every skill you master, every problem you solve, every act of cooperation or creativity becomes part of the accumulated human legacy that will be passed forward to future generations. The prehistoric humans we followed through their day couldn't have imagined the world we live in now, but their daily choices made our world possible. In the same way, the choices you make in your daily life, choices that might seem small and insignificant, are helping to create possibilities that you can't even imagine for humans who won't be born for thousands of years. As we reach the end of our journey through a single prehistoric day, we've discovered something remarkable. That day never really ended. It extended forward through time, each moment building on the previous moment, each generation building on the achievements of the previous generation, until that ancient morning became this modern morning, and those ancient humans became us. The next time you wake up, whether to an alarm clock or to sunlight streaming through your window, remember that you're participating in humanity's oldest ritual, the daily renewal of our species' commitment to survival, growth and discovery. The curiosity that drives you to learn something new, the creativity that pushes you to solve problems in novel ways, the compassion that moves you to help others. These aren't modern inventions. They're ancient human traits that have been passed down to you through an unbroken chain of ancestors who faced each new day with the same mixture of hope, determination and wonder that you bring to your own life. Our prehistoric ancestors couldn't have known that their daily routines were laying the foundation for space travel, global communication and medical miracles, but they could know, as you can know, that each day offers the opportunity to learn something new, to create something valuable and to pass something meaningful forward to the future. In that sense, we're not just connected to our Stone Age ancestors, we're continuing their work, and their story is our story, still being written one day at a time. Conclusion. The morning mirror. Tomorrow morning, when your alarm goes off at 7 a.m, I want you to try something. Before you reach for your phone, before you stumble toward the coffee maker, before you check the weather or the news or your messages, I want you to lie in bed for just 60 seconds and think about this. 40,000 years ago, at this exact moment, a human being just like you was opening their eyes to greet a new day. They had the same sized brain you do, the same capacity for joy, fear, curiosity and love, the same ability to solve problems, create beauty and care deeply about their family, the same restless drive to make today better than yesterday. But they were about to spend the next 16 hours doing something that no other species had ever attempted. They were going to consciously, deliberately build the future. Every choice they made that day, which plants to gather, how to improve a tool, what story to tell around the fire, was shaping the world you woke up in this morning. The language you think in was born in their conversations. The technology you depend on grew from their innovations. The social bonds that give your life meaning evolved from their cooperation. Even your morning routine of waking up, eating, working and relaxing follows patterns they established when our species was still young. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. They had no idea they were creating the future. They thought they were just trying to get through another day. They couldn't imagine cities or computers or space travel. They couldn't foresee that their daily conversations would become literature, their hunting strategies would become military science, their evening stories would become movies. They were simply doing what humans do, facing each day with curiosity, creativity, and an unshakable determination to thrive. And that's exactly what you're doing too. Right now, in your seemingly ordinary daily routine, you're continuing their work. Every problem you solve, every skill you learn, every act of kindness you show, every creative idea you have is adding another layer to the human story they began. The choices you make today are shaping a future you can't imagine, for people who won't be born for thousands of years. Your prehistoric ancestors couldn't have known that sharing food with a sick group member would evolve into modern healthcare systems. They couldn't have predicted that their evening discussions would become democracy, their tool-making would become space exploration, their art would become the internet. But they could know, as you can know, that each day offers the opportunity to learn something new, to help someone else, and to leave the world a little better than you found it. So tomorrow morning, when you open your eyes, remember that you're not just waking up to another day. You're waking up to another chapter in the greatest story ever told. The story of how curiosity, creativity and cooperation transformed a small group of African primates into the dominant species on Earth and eventually into the beings who would reach for the stars. Your Stone Age ancestors spent their days dreaming of a better tomorrow for their children. You are that tomorrow. You are their wildest dreams made real. And the dreams you dream today, the work you do today, the love you share today, will become someone else's reality in a future so wonderful that even you can't imagine it. The cavemen didn't just survive their day. They used it to build your world. Now it's your turn. What are you going to do with your 16 hours?